Today's podcast is brought to you by Funny Bone Broth, now available at Italy and McEwen's in the TD Center.
In a world where it seems totally normal to listen to a podcast about the Toronto Argonauts, it's the X's and Argos podcast.
Welcome to the X's and Argos podcast. Ben Grant along with JB. We've got another outstanding show for you today, including an interview with Dave Naylor coming up, TSN Football Insider. And of course, we are going to break down the CFL 2020 all-time Argos team that came out this past week. Some interesting choices, some that were very obvious, of course, as well. So we'll get into that a little bit to kick off the show. JB, first of all, first impressions when you saw that, anything that stood out to you as they went through those all-time Argos that you thought, oh, that's a bit weird.
I had hoped that it might be more controversial, more debatable. But, it was pretty chalk.
But are you saying bad? Like you want it to be wrong?
Well, I don't know, wrong. I think I would like to have seen them make a less obvious choice, I guess. I would have liked to have seen a little more, outside the box picks. But, you can't argue with any of their picks. Certainly all our statue recipients were on the team. So I thought it was fine. I just maybe a little boring, to be honest.
Yeah, but I don't think, because again, I don't know how you can, like if you came out with the fourth receiver was like Titus Dixon or something like that, it just doesn't, like it would just seem so clearly you trying to stir something up. I don't think even for the purposes of viewership, doing something like that could be subtle enough to even make it happen, because there are just so many clear-cut guys.
No, I mean, you and I debated, I thought maybe if they'd made the roster smaller.
But I actually thought the roster is too small for a team that's 150 years old. Like you got 150 years in there and you're trying to narrow it down to, this small group of guys.
It is pretty amazing when you think about how unargumentative that list is. Like it is pretty amazing over 150 years that you could come up with a list that didn't cause any debate. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Well, it's also a bit misleading because we say 150 years, but like how many guys are on here from, the 1880s or, early 1900s? There aren't any.
Yeah, Lionel Conacher didn't make the cut.
Right. But even guys before that, it's just, we don't know. Like we don't even know what the team's record was for some of those seasons back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And then when we finally do start knowing what the records were, we don't always know who the players were, what positions they played. It was different football back then, too. You had 14 guys on the field. Running backs were called line plungers. There were all sorts of weird rules. So, and everyone played both ways and sometimes multiple positions.
Although I do think, and we could talk about this, it is pretty amazing that after 150 years, Doug Flutie is still chosen as the quarterback.
Yeah.
That in 150 years, the guy who was here for 2 years is still the best guy we ever had.
But we've talked about this on the show before, it's hard to argue. I've been arguing it with everybody just to play devil's advocate. I love Doug Flutie. I've got a bobblehead Doug Flutie sitting right in front of me, and he's one of my favorite Argos quarterbacks, probably my second favorite Argos quarterback of all time, behind Conrad Holloway. He was amazing. And so you can't argue with those 2 years. That just becomes a debate as to whether or not you think there's a time frame on how long you have to have been an Argo in order to make that list. And clearly The answer is 2 years.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what the answer is. Is 4 better than 2? I don't know.
I think it depends on if it's 2 Hall of Fame worthy years, 2 record setting years, then I think the answer is 2. I don't know I don't think you could ever have I don't think anyone would be accepting of 1 season, but I think 2 seems to be the minimum. And so if you can put in 2 Hall of Fame numbers kind of seasons, then that's enough to end up on an all-time team. And the thing is with Argo quarterbacks, like the Argos, well, it's not even quarterbacks, it's every position. There are just so many positions throughout history in the Argos where guys are only here for a few years. There aren't a lot of guys that played for the Argos for a long period of time, especially in recent years. And that's really what we're talking about, like years where there is some film footage of these guys playing. And the thing is that, it's a little bit of a bus stop sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, Damon Allen or Matt Dunnigan or Ricky Ray, I mean, those guys all had significant careers with other teams.
Right.
So it's hard to say, well, that guy's an Argo. Now, the argument would be Holloway, I guess, would be, is Doug Flutie the best quarterback to ever play for the Argos? Probably.
Yes. Yeah.
Is he the best Argos quarterback? I mean, they kind of cheated when they brought in Holloway, through the back door on their list. I thought they were going to go Holloway since they had already made Flutie the all-time quarterback of another team.
I know, and I'd actually heard that earlier in the week too, but I guess it was just the fact that that Holloway was named as a foundational player, so that he did make the list. But it's a little bit of an out. There were a few outs that I thought TSN took in this one. We can talk about some of those, but let's talk about the coach first of all. So when I guess you probably
Obilovich.
Yeah, you weren't surprised when it was Obilovich.
No, I love Obilovich.
Yeah, and I get that. There are a couple of things. Like his run in the 80s was awesome. He had that Grey Cup in there with Holloway in 83. But not all of his stints with the Argos went that well. Like he had a couple other stints with the Argos that went sideways in a hurry. And, I remember those pretty well. And so I don't know. I'm not saying he shouldn't be there. I was trying to think of who I would have put instead. And the thing is, there's guys that I just don't know about. Like, Ted Morris was a coach after the war, and he won 3 Grey Cups in 5 years. That's pretty good. But I don't know. Like, I have no idea anything about Ted Morris other than, that sounds like a pretty good record, 3 Grey Cups in 5 years. What's his name? Sinclair McEvenew. It was another one that I would love to know more about his backstory. He was the head coach for a couple of years in the 20s. He had an undefeated season, beat Edmonton 23-0 in the Grey Cup after a nail-biting semifinal win over the Parkdale Canoe Club. And you wonder, what kind of coaching went on there. But, who knows? Maybe that was a guy that was more interested in the rowing side of things than the football side of things. I don't know. But, I just feel like maybe a greater exploration needed to have been done for me to feel happy that Obilovich really was the guy.
Yeah, I mean, again, nobody really jumps out.
Because there's nobody that didn't have bad years. That's the problem with the Argos, is that we haven't had...
No, or had a really long run.
Right. Like there's no Argos coach where they were here for 10 years and every one of those 10 years was a great season and there were like 3 Grey Cups along the way. It's the yo-yo effect that we've talked about a lot, where you'll have an amazing season and then the very next year, for sometimes seemingly no reason at all, we got 4 wins. And then we win the Grey Cup with a 7-win season. Like I don't know. It doesn't lend itself to having a great Hall of Fame list, as I'm sure they found when they were trying to put this list together. Any issue with the running backs? I think Dick Shadow obviously makes total sense. Pinball Clemens has to be somewhere on this team. A running back, though? What do you think?
Yeah, at first blush, I was, I thought, well, that's a bit of a cheat so they can get Owens on there. At returner, but I mean, we talked about off air. I think Pinball. I mean, look, the reality is Pinball's number 2 in rushing yards, and he leads in receptions from the tailback position. So even though I don't think you immediately think of him as a running back first, I mean, the numbers are the numbers. I think he does deserve to be there as a running back.
The other guys that I thought maybe could be in there, because I really expected Pinball to be on there as special teams or potentially even as foundational, because like he he played, I think it was 12 seasons, if I'm not wrong there, with the Argos. It's a long time, obviously, to play with a single team. But, when you look at those numbers, like he really only averaged about, 2.5 rushing touchdowns a season. And you think, well, is that the team's best running back of all time? But you're right. Like, he was an amazing receiver out of the backfield. He holds every, reception record as a running back. And just watching him, he was someone you had to account for. So I'm not sure his rushing numbers maybe tell the whole story. And I think that's part of the issue here, but he's certainly deserving of being there. But there are a couple other guys that you had to kind of miss. One is Gil Fenerty.
Yeah, I know.
He had 3 great seasons. It was just 3 seasons, but great seasons, like 10 touchdowns, 12 touchdowns,
he was a star.
And then off to the New Orleans Saints. But he was a weird, they found him, the Argos found him playing in Italy. So he was playing in Italy. The Argos found him and they're like, look at this guy. And they brought him over, had 3 amazing seasons. And then suddenly he's playing with New Orleans. He's on Super Tecmo Bowl, if you want to go back and relive that. Just an amazing running back, but only 3 years, and he's not pinball. But man, his numbers were outstanding. He was a beast. And then you got Bill Simons, who was named a foundational player, but he was awesome too. He had 7 years with the Argos, first Argo ever to rush for over 1,000 yards, and that's back in 1968. He had 44 receptions that same year. Like that's a terrific performance from a running back. And yes, he's named a foundational player, but and there is film on him. You can actually watch some really awkward black and white 1960s CFL film on Bill Simons if you want to look it up on YouTube. He was powerful. He had moves, grace, really good hands. So, that's another guy that they could have gone that way. But you probably don't want both your running backs to have been from the 50s and 60s.
No, exactly. And, Chad Owens was electric for the Argos. I mean, he's the last star we had. Really? Like, who has been a star for the Argos since him?
A guy that people will go to watch the games for? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you can make an argument for a couple of guys, but no one like Chad Owens was that way.
No, I don't think so.
So, receivers, we pretty much had these 4 guys locked in already.
Yeah. I mean, they're, that's chalk across the board there.
So I think that made sense. Offensive line was the most difficult because like I've only been able to somewhat evaluate offensive line play for about 15 or 20 years. So that's really limiting. And there just aren't any offensive line stats that exist prior to that. So you're really having to take a shot in the dark with a lot of these guys, going off newspaper articles and things like that. And it's not a position that's written about. So you end up with 3 of your 5 guys being very modern, and then 2 of them that had played into the late 60s and early 70s. So we're not going way back for that positional group either. There's one offensive lineman that got left off. That again, and I don't know what I'm talking about because we're talking about a guy that played decades before I was born. But Les Ascott is one. He was a guard and tackle for 11 years with the Argos, 5 Grey Cups in those 11 years. His jersey was retired back in 2004. And you just wonder, why didn't he make it? And I don't have any argument for him, never having seen him play. And I don't think there's any film of him in existence. And maybe that's the answer there. But, it's a guy whose jersey was retired, played for 11 years, won 5 Grey Cups. Maybe he's at least gets mentioned as a foundational player or something like that. I don't know. It just felt strange that he wasn't on the list. It was a name I expected to be there, but I can't really argue with anyone else that's on here.
No, I think it's hard. It's hard for players pre-film, to get a fair shake. So, I mean, I think you're right. I think that's probably just a matter of, you can't have the entire offensive line come before 1960.
The defensive line was pretty straightforward. We knew that Rodney Harding was going to be on there, Harrington, Corrigal, Stillwagon. Those aren't names that came out of nowhere. Those were obviously all on our radar. We knew Mike O'Shea would be there at linebacker, Don Moen as well. And Kevin Iben, I thought, was an interesting sort of cheat, if you will. And not that Iben doesn't deserve to be there. I think he does. but the way that they're sort of circumventing their own rules here is that TSN had said that every team must have a current player, or I think they worded it differently because Ivan's obviously not playing for us anymore, but it must have a current member on the team. And Toronto is the only team without a current player on their roster, but Ivan, being a coach they put on there, has a linebacker, and that's how they kind of get around that they created a loophole for themselves by putting Kevin Ivan there. Again, deserving, but it's like, come on, that's a bit weird, isn't it?
I mean, I think it speaks to where the team is in process and what the league thinks about the Argos roster.
Well, it's just a new roster. Like there's only like 5 guys on the roster who've played more than 2 seasons.
Right. I mean, that's it. It's a very young roster.
The defensive secondary went pretty much as we thought it was. You knew that Reggie Pleasant was going to be there, Adrian Smith, the late Marv Luster, Orlando Steinhauer, who I still love despite his Tiger Cat leanings. That made sense. There wasn't anyone on there where I thought, well, I have a better answer. There were a couple other guys I was thinking of, but I can't find a way to really piece them in. So I thought those 5 guys were perfect. Anyone you changed on that list?
No, I think, when you look at it, it laid itself out in such a way that I think it would be, I just think it'd be very difficult to argue any of it. I think because they gave themselves such a large roster, I don't, I think if you have, if you have 5 defensive backs, that's going to cover it. You're going to be hard pressed to come up with 6 or 7 or 8, generational defensive backs.
Special teams, we talked about, how amazing Chad Owens was, and that makes sense as a returner. Obviously, Chad Owens, if you're not going to go pinball, then Chad's the guy. You could make an argument for Raheem Ishmael, but again, it's just not long enough. Like, it was really just 1 year, and the other year wasn't enough to really talk about. So,
and I think they want some nod to the past decade.
Yeah, you do need someone in there. There aren't a lot of guys.
If Chad Owens is in there, and they have Kevin Ivan, like, 2007 was the last time there was a good Argo.
Yeah, well, yeah, let's not talk about that. So, place kicker punter. I have one objection here, and I don't. Well, it's not an objection because
what? Come on, those 2 guys are.
I love Chomick. I love Prefontaine. Hank Alisic, though. So here's a guy from my formative football years. 13 seasons with the Argos. He punted, place kicked, kickoffs. He was a straight leg kicker, or what do they call those guys with the little boot on the front? Like, he didn't kick soccer style. He kicked just with his toes, which is a style that I have since used in my 1 field goal attempt, which you were there for, which missed low.
Unfortunately, pre-phone camera.
Yeah, I'm glad that wasn't caught on film. Well, I went with a straight toe kick,
and then you nearly killed.
But
somebody.
I didn't have those fancy. I almost killed someone with my kick attempt. It went fast. That ball flew off my foot about 4 yards high.
Well, luckily they were wearing gear when they got harpooned in the middle of their sternum.
Yeah, hit my starting safety in the sternum. Did not try a field goal after that. But yeah, Alisic used to have those special toe shoes. They were like, they had a flat toe at the front, and there were sort of laces to have them angled up. So the toe was at like a 45-degree angle with a flat front to it, and that was his place kicking shoe and his kickoff shoe, and then he would have a different shoe for punting, which I thought was kind of cool.
But who do you kick off for him?
I don't know, and another problem with that, you look at Hank Alisic. I was looking at his records, and his records are for like most punting yards in a season, and that doesn't say a lot about a team.
No.
So I don't know. Like he was a very good place kicker, very good punter. Played for so long, but yeah, I get why he's not on here.
Yeah, I mean those 2 guys are pretty, if I can use the word as a kicking fan, iconic. They are iconic kickers, those 2.
Yeah, I can't argue that. The foundational guys made sense. Royal Copeland, Joe King Kroll, who you have to have in there, who played like every position. It's fun reading about some of the stuff he did.
What a great nickname too.
That is a fantastic nickname. There's some really nice ones, and of course Ulysses Crazy Legs Curtis.
Yeah, we don't have nicknames anymore like that.
Not a lot. Like the nicknames certainly aren't. Not that they were self-deprecating in their time, but sort of looking back on them now, the nicknames that we tend to like are somewhat comical, I think. And you wouldn't really give somebody a nickname like that. There might be some that stick around, but it's just not what we do. Like there was an era where pretty much everyone on any sports team had a nickname, and it just doesn't work like that anymore.
No, and you know, it's true. It's probably for the best.
It probably is. And Conrad Holloway, of course, being the foundational player, we talked about him already, but I was really happy that he made that list because I thought he might be the quarterback.
I would have liked to have seen him as the quarterback, but you know, I guess this is, you know, not, you know, at least they recognized his worth to the franchise.
And they gave the Argos 2 extra foundational players, which again could be looked at as another cheat. But when we're talking about 150 years, I think, yeah, you've earned those extra 2 foundational players. So deal with it. And at the end of the day, TSN can do what they like. So
I you know, not to feed a fed horse. I do think the list is an indictment, though. If you look at, you know, really, this list could have been made in 2002.
You would only be missing like 3 players off this team.
I mean, so like you're talking about 18 years where you were not able to generate a single player.
The other way I would look at it is that there were some really powerful teams in that the 96-97 group, the 91 group, the 83 group. Like those were powerful teams, and so most of the all-time Argos are going to come out of those 3 groups.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know. Is there an argument for anybody?
Really, the best argument you've got for modern players is Ricky Ray, and I still think that Holloway and Flutie are ahead of him. So
yeah, Ricky Ray, all-time yardage leader, 2 Grey Cup winning. Nobody likes Ricky Ray.
Well, because again, I don't even know. I'm not even sure I think of him as an Argo.
No,
so
it's very weird.
Yeah, it's just
I don't know. I don't know. It's like why some people are television stars and some are movie stars. I don't know why Ricky Ray doesn't resonate with me or anybody that I can tell. But he just doesn't. I don't know. It's the damnedest thing.
Yeah, it is an odd thing, and you know, I completely understand what you're saying, and I think any Argo fan does. You know, as much as you love him, you kind of look at it and you're like, yeah, what is it that's missing here? That's not.
I don't know. It's like Rick Vive from the Leafs in the 80s.
Yeah, I loved Rick Vive.
You don't see a lot. Nobody wears a Rick Vive jersey.
Well, that's true.
You know, but
he was awesome.
But so he was good, and he was good for the Leafs, but you know, it's just not Daryl Sittler or Wendell Clark. You know, I don't know what it is. It's just sometimes guys don't catch on.
All right, well, why don't we get to our interview with Dave Naylor? Having a TSN guy on here helps us a little bit because maybe we can get into some of these decisions that were made and talk about some of the controversial comments that were made with regards to who should be the starting quarterback. I thought that was an interesting discussion, so I'll ask Dave Naylor about that, and we'll reflect post-interview on what the TSN representative had to say. I'm joined now by TSN football insider Dave Naylor. Dave, thanks for taking some time to talk some Canadian football with me today.
My pleasure. Very much so.
So Argos fans are buzzing about this week's episode of CFL 2020. They previewed the Argos, of course, as you know, and Milt Stegall and Davis Sanchez were on the McLeod Bethel Thompson train, and Dunnigan and Burris saying, no way, it's got to be Matt Nichols. I got to know, where do you stand? Who's right? Who's wrong? What do you think?
I got to say, I'm in the Matt Nichols camp on this one. And I think you just look at it and say, what has a guy accomplished in his Canadian Football League career? I mean, it's funny that, and a little bit kind of like sad is more the word for Matt Nichols, is that if you look at his era as a Winnipeg Blue Bomber quarterback, and it's not that long, like we're talking like 4 seasons, it's among the most productive, successful eras in Bomber history. And you know, that's why I thought they would go back to him even after the Grey Cup win, because, I mean, you know, Zach Collaros is, you know, 4 games removed from a lot of people in the league not thinking he was a good risk. And he played 4 games in remarkable circumstances, and it's a historical performance that we'll look back on. But is it indicative of the future for him? That's the debate. And look, Matt Nichols has had kind of the same issue that's been around Zach a little bit, and that is that he gets injured a lot. Now, his injuries have not been the kind that, you know, are related to head injuries and put you out for a season. I was at Bomber training camp 2 years ago when, you know, he took 5 steps and boom, down he went, and he missed, you know, the next 4 weeks. And we've seen, and I think he's played nicked up and banged up. You always heard whispers around him that he's, you know, his shoulder or his elbow or his knee or something wasn't right. So I think that's part of what, but overall, I mean, you could look at it and say, you know, he had a great offensive coordinator in Paul LaPolice. They had a great offensive line. He's got a, you know, historically great running back there. And that all takes pressure off him to win games. But I still think that when you look at his overall stats and look at the way he was performing when he went out last season, I mean, he was, you know, playing as well. Matt Nichols' success tends to revolve around his ability to secure the football. When he's not throwing interceptions, he can win you games. When he throws interceptions, he can't. And, you know, there was that little blip in the 2018 season when he went about a month and, you know, fired a whole bunch of interceptions and you know, the Bombers lost a bunch of games. And I don't know that I've ever known a quarterback who takes the ability to secure the football as personally as Matt Nichols does. Like when he turns it over, it crushes him, you know, and it's important for every quarterback. You know, the stats are there about turnovers, interceptions, wins and losses. But for Matt Nichols, I honestly think it's more top of mind for him than almost any quarterback I've ever been around. So I think he should be the guy. Now, McLeod Bethel-Thompson is an interesting case because he's an older guy for, you know, somebody who's still relatively inexperienced in the CFL. He's a lifer, right? He's a guy who, by his own admission, wants to play football and grind it out, you know, in any way he can. And I think there was a lack of patience for him, you know, with the Argonauts the last few years, just because we forget sometimes that when a guy comes in at 22 or 23, we understand he's going to take some time to learn the game. Well, when a guy comes in at, you know, 29 or 30, it's still going to take him time to learn the game. His age doesn't really make that much difference when it comes to adapting to the CFL game. And again, he's one of the things he hasn't had trouble with is staying healthy. So I like the 1-2 combination of Matt Nichols based on his record, based on his performance last year. He's been a winner with the understanding that if we were talking about an 18-game season, he probably isn't going to get through all 18. His history would tell you that may be an issue. Or even you may want to sit him for a couple of weeks just to allow him to get healthy if he's nicked up, even if he could go. And you've got a great 1A option in McLeod Bethel-Thompson who, look, I think his performance, his comeback against Winnipeg last year in that second half of that Argo win, the 0-5 Argos beating the 5-0 Bombers, I think that may have saved his career. And, you know, from that point on, he was a very competent CFL quarterback on a not very good team.
Especially against Ottawa. He looked excellent against Ottawa. But,
if you put those stats over 18 games, he's going to the Hall of Fame off one season. Sure,
exactly. So, what did you think of the all-time Argos list that was put out? Because I think it's such a difficult thing to do. You're talking about a team with 150 years of history. But were there any selections or omissions that kind of made you raise a Spockian eyebrow?
You know, it wasn't so much individual omissions. It was more kind of the nature of this team of how many players were on the list that maybe didn't spend that much time with the Toronto Argonauts. You know, like one of the things about this team is, and when you evaluate an all-time team, you can, you know, is somebody like Doug Flutie, who played 2 years for the Argonauts, what was, you know, historically great in those 2 years, you know, worth more than somebody who played a whole bunch of years. And that's one of the things with the Argos, which is weird because, you know, you have a team like, you have some organizations that have been good a lot of years, but they never win the Grey Cup, but they're never terrible. And the Argonauts have been really good and really bad, really good and really bad. And the problem when you go from being really good to being really bad is you turn your roster over. right? This is what we're probably going to get into a little bit, talking about where the Argos are right now. And so you have players that are on that roster that were not Argos necessarily for great lengths of time, because they kind of got caught in the swoon of the turnover, or in Flutie's case, going to the National Football League. I mean, I guess one of the things that jumped out at me was, the quarterback position. There are so many Argo quarterbacks who've been great, but how many of them have been there's a reason Ricky Ray is the all-time leading quarterback in the Toronto Argonauts, which is stunning, because most of us still think of him as primarily an Edmonton Eskimo. But that just tells you how much that position has turned over. So whether you wanted to put Matt Dunnigan on that list, or we wouldn't have put Tracy Ham because he wasn't very good as an Argo, or others, there's just been so much turnover. A lot of players, the two teams that really kind of jumped out at me that were well represented were the 91 Argos, where you have Pinball Clemens, Darrell K. Smith, Rodney Harding, Reggie Pleasant, and then that group kind of the late 90s, right, where you had Steinauer and O'Shea and Mookie Mitchell, and that's kind of really what jumped. And of course, Mike Clemens on the 91 team as well. So when I think of the Argonauts of the last 30 years, I think of even though they've won some great cups, 04, 2012, 2017, I wouldn't put any of those teams in kind of great team categories. The only two I would are the 91 team and the 96, 97 group. And I thought it was appropriate that those groups were well represented. I mean, there's so many players you can think of that have been good for the Argonauts in shorter periods of time. And I think every time I think of one, whether it's a Robert Drummond at running back, or Chris Gaines at linebacker, or guys like that who were very good players, they also had very short tenures. I mean, the Argos, and I think this is probably part of the challenge marketing the team over the last 30 years, is there's been so much turnover on their roster. And I say that relative to other CFL teams, I think it's when you look at the consistency on other teams, but it's a pretty good roster, I got to say, and when I look at guys, going back to the 91 team, when you look at guys like Don Moen, Chris Schultz, Dan Ferrone, those teams are very well represented. And you could almost do an all-time Argo team just taking the 96 and 97 team and the 91 team. And I'm 52, so I can't, I remember Jim Corrigal, but when you start to get into Stillwagon and Shadow and those guys, I'm limited like everybody else in terms of, trying to pick out guys that I thought Jim, it was, Rocket Ismail would have been an interesting one. Had one really kind of dynamic year for the Argonauts. 92, he was not at all the same player, but they didn't have it all the same team. He was an exciting guy. But again, we put him next to Chad Owens, who won an MOP. If I was choosing Rocket Ismail in his prime or Chad Owens in his prime, I might take Rocket Ismail, but I can't argue with the performance that Chad Owens as a Toronto Argonaut was a more impactful player than Rocket Ismail was.
Yeah, they were both so electric.
Yeah.
You talked about the roster turnover over the years. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this year. Right now we've got 68 Toronto Argonauts without a jersey number assigned to them. Have you ever seen anything like this from a non-expansion team before?
I never have. I mean, and look, it's, I think it's a lot of time what organizations need to do when you come in. Like for instance, I was critical of Montreal, under Cafus Reed, that they didn't do this, early on. They tried to patch it together. And I assume some of that came from pressure from ownership, that they hadn't been in the playoffs. They want to see them in the playoffs. As opposed to say what Chris Jones did in Saskatchewan, when he went in and essentially did this, right? And said, hey, we're going to be young. We're going to be exciting. We may not win right away, but, we're going to build something here. And they really did. Maybe not a coincidence that John Murphy was central to that rebuilding in Saskatchewan under Chris Jones. And he's the one engineering a lot of what's going on in Toronto right now. And
he one-upped himself, though. Like this is
yeah, no, he absolutely did. But I'm always sort of hesitant about teams that try to build themselves through free agency. But I thought the Argos did a really good job in free agency this year. I mean, their Canadian receiver position, which has been woeful, really for the last number of years. I mean, there are lots of good Canadian receivers, and they just had not been very good at getting those kind of players. And yet you look at the way they've built up that position. linebacker, others. It's basically, I think a lot of this is John Murphy betting on himself. Like John's one of these guys who, he grinds it out 24 hours a day. Like if you call John Murphy at 3:30 in the morning, he's probably texting with an agent he's that kind of guy, right? So I think he relishes the opportunity to just kind of, go with a completely blank palette and start over. I think that was, and given the way the Argonauts have played the last few years, you could certainly see, the reason for doing that. And, even some of their best players were guys that either were long in the tooth, like an S.J. Green, or were making tons of money, like a Darrell Walker. So, even that part of it. But I've never seen anything quite this dramatic. And yet I think they have a chance to be, a decent team.
You talk about the receiver rebuild, this receiving core. There's one guy missing on that list, and I know you looked into this a lot. Is the TJ Jones dream dead in Toronto? What do you make of that?
I think there are some issues that have fallen by the wayside because of the preoccupation with trying to get the season going, with the pandemic. And it's funny because I remember I was reporting on the TJ Jones issue when I was at the NFL Combine in Indianapolis, which was February 24th to 27th. Now, think how much the world changed in 2 weeks after that. I mean, I was, standing in Joe Burrow's scrum, with 150 other reporters. I was going out to bars at night, wasn't even thinking about it. Of course, a lot changed within 2 weeks. And in that, the TJ Jones story did. Like, I believe there was some conversation between the Players Association and the league about, I'm trying to remember how this was. The concern was that in paying TJ Jones $200,000, they were taking money away from other Canadian. It took a disproportionate amount of money away from other Canadian players because he had this status that he didn't have to be subject to the rookie cap. Now, I don't agree with that. Like I'm a more of a free market guy when it comes to sports. I actually like socialism in society. I don't like it in sports. And so I don't agree with this. I don't understand why saying, hey, if he makes $200,000, that takes money away from other Canadians in that locker room. How about Mike Riley making $700,000? What does that do to the guys in the BC Lions locker room? And where's the Players Association on that one? Well, they're nowhere, and they shouldn't be there. Like, I don't think that the point is, I think sometimes, and I'm going to say this, try to do this with respect, sometimes this league is run more in the interest of the owners or the players, not the fans. And I think this is an issue right here where the players and the owners are arguing over this TJ Jones thing. Come on. The Canadian Football League is better with TJ Jones than it is without. He's Canadian. He fits the rules. If you're going to say that you're going to limit the salary of a 5-year NFL vet, that he's not going to be able to come to the CFL with a free market, then you're not going to have any. As I wrote when I was in Indianapolis, if you enforce this rule the way it's written, you're basically saying the best Canadian football players on the planet will never step foot in the CFL because they're not going from the National Football League to making $65,000 Canadian. It's nonsensical. So even trying to limit that, and I'm trying to remember the details of what the Players Association proposal was on this, but it was some way to kind of mitigate the amount of money that he was taking up. And I'm sorry, so much has happened between now and the time that was in detail, and I wish I had the details of it. But it was basically, I guess what I could say is, it was manipulating the market, artificially limiting the market, right? And I just don't think that's in the fans' interest. Because what people got to understand is that if TJ Jones isn't playing in the CFL, the guy who replaces him on the roster is off the street, right? That's who you're signing. So is this league better with a 5-year NFL vet, who's a legit player, or a guy who right now is on the street? I just can't wrap my head around it. I thought that the league's rule changes in recent years to allow guys that are Canadians, even if they didn't grow up in Canada, if you got Canadian citizenship, if your parents do. Look, I think that was an improvement because it improved the level of talent in the league. Nobody thinks the league is worse because Alex Singleton, starred at middle linebacker for 3 years. And is there a guy in this league who represented our league better, who had more involvement and position and contribution to his community in Calgary than Alex Singleton did? I don't think there is. So, it didn't exactly hurt the league that he was given Canadian status, right? And I know he came through the draft, which is different. The TJ Jones thing is such a unique thing because he wasn't taken in the draft because the rule was different then, right? So it's not like we're going to have necessarily a ton of these guys, because most of these guys are going to be property of a team. But we are going to need to do something about the rule that says they can't make more than 65,000. And it's a rule that I think benefits some players. I don't think it benefits fans. And I really think this league is at a point in time in its existence where the fans' interests have to come before the players. The fans' interests have to come before the owners. And this is a clear example of me. The point is, I don't think it's going to get resolved in time for anything this season. I could be wrong about that. It's just one that's kind of slipped off the radar for a while. But I have an opinion on it, as you can tell.
Yes, which is not a shock, but awesome. So we talked a little bit about fans getting behind the team, the league, and what's best for the fans. In the city of Toronto, there have maybe been 2 or 3 occasions in my lifetime where I felt like the city was legitimately behind the team. Once in the early 80s, and then again with Rocket Ismail and that ownership group, and maybe with the Doug Flutie era too.
And briefly in 2012, because you had the 100th Grey Cup, the Argos were there, and the NHL conveniently shut down, which
that worked out.
Yeah.
But what do the Argos do? Like, if you're MLSE, what do you do to try and make this team Toronto's team, like truly Toronto's team?
As you could probably guess, I have spent a lot of hours, some of them in the middle of the night, some of them while I'm driving my car, some of them in the shower, some of them probably while I'm talking to other people, thinking about this question. Because the Toronto Argonauts really are unique in this way. I mean, they have a 150-year-old brand. The number of people I meet, who are maybe in their 60s or 70s and know what I do for a living, and they're Southern Ontario people, and they tell me that they had Argos seasons tickets and they went to every game, and then they'll turn to me and say, why don't people care like they used to? And I will say, how many kids do you have? And they will say, I have 3. And I'll say, do your kids follow the Argonauts? And they will say, no. And I will say, that's why, because somehow you didn't pass it on to them, right? And it really is a generational thing that happened around the mid-1980s. Right after the Argonauts won that 1983 Grey Cup, the Blue Jays get into their first pennant race in 94. They're playing, or in 84, excuse me, they're up against New York, Boston, Detroit, and all of a sudden it was like Toronto outgrew the Canadian Football League. The answer to the question is very, very difficult because lots of things have been tried. If there's anything I'm most disappointed about, I guess it's that the move to BMO did not create a resurgence. I would have done things differently moving there. I would have gone to all extremes to try to fill that stadium. I mean, when they had 12,000 people there for their second date there, that was a killer. I don't care if you've got to go dig up corpses in the cemetery and stick them in the stands. There can't be 12,000 people in that stadium for the second game at BMO. That cannot happen, because that, to me, was like the BMO dream died that night. A Tuesday night game against Ottawa, 12,000 people in the stands. Can't happen. And I know they don't want to get into giveaways and things like that, but I would have spent a year with MLSE Resort. At that time, it wasn't MLSE. It was Bell and Larry Tannenbaum. But still, no shortage of resources. I would have spent a year filling that stadium and making it a place to be, rather than saying we're not going to give away tickets and having 12,000 people there on the second night. It hasn't helped that in whatever it's been, 4 years they've been at BMO, 3 of the years they've sucked. And when I say sucked, I mean not just that they've lost more games than they've won, it's been unentertaining football. And I say that as an Argonaut season ticket holder who pays for my seats. I do not get comp seats. I pay like everybody else. So I'm evaluating the value of the entertainment experience on the same basis everyone else is. But what I would do, I do a lot of things they're trying to do. I would try to raise the game day awareness. That's one thing. I would love to stand at Yonge and Bloor on an Argonaut game day and ask people if they know when the next time the Argonauts play is. I think it would be stunning at the number you'd get. And as somebody very smart said to me once, if people know we're playing, I can't guarantee they will come to our game. But if they don't know we're playing, I can guarantee you they're not coming. And I honestly think the awareness of when the Toronto Argonauts play at home is so low that you're limiting yourself to a small portion of the population that even know they're playing. So that would be the first thing I would do. I would do a lot to raise the awareness that a game is happening, because people cannot attend a game that they do not know is happening. And that's to me the biggest problem. And I say, I'd love to try that experiment sometime. Maybe I'll do it. Maybe I'll stand there with a clipboard at Yonge and Bloor at noon on an Argo game day and just say, do you know when the Toronto Argonauts next play? It would be stunningly low, right? So that would be my first thing. I think the idea of getting young people into the stadiums, encouraging families to bring kids and making that like a discount point, which they've done. I like some of the things they've done to the game day experience, but it's hard, right? It's like, unfortunately, trying to sell me on soccer. Doesn't matter what you do, I'm just not interested. And that's just where I grew up. Soccer is not a big thing in my upbringing. I don't understand the game. So many of the rules don't make sense to me. And every time I give myself to it, there's a 0-0 game or something, and I say, why would I do this again? Like there's lots of people like that on Canadian football, and it doesn't matter how you. So in a way, you got to kind of get people at the young experience. I would try to take advantage of what great ambassadors these players are for the game, their willingness. And I know they've done some of these things, to go into schools, to be communities with groups. I mean, the players in this league are incredible. I mean, I've covered, the NFL, hockey, Major League Baseball, the NBA. I've covered them all. And the players in this league will do things because they understand that that's part of the role that they have to help the league continue, to thrive. I take advantage of that as much as you can. But the biggest thing to me would just be that they're not doing, because I can give you all kinds of things they're already doing, discount on beers and hot dogs and on all those kinds of things. But I would say just incentives for parents to bring kids to games and raise awareness of when they play. That would be my two big things.
I can give you the results of that Young Bloor survey right now. I think it's going to be so low, but yeah, you're right.
Does it make sense that you're if 1% of the population knows there's a game, then you're marketing to 1% of the population, not 99. 99% of people are ruled out. They logically cannot come to your game because they don't know it's happening.
And what's even scarier, I think, is even football people, like teams that I've coached, whether it's high school or semi-pro, like I'll talk about, excited about the Argos game this weekend. And most of them have no idea that there's a game. And those are guys that are playing football, some of whom, have even been in the CFL or trying to get into the CFL. And they don't even know when the schedule, when the schedule is and when the Argos are playing.
And there is a real disconnect, not just between young people in general in the Canadian Football League in Southern Ontario, but between young football players in general. And that is mind-boggling when you think of it, right? And I could name you, but I don't want to embarrass these guys, okay? I could name you some very prominent CFL Canadian players who are been held up as the model of what we want Canadian football players to be. They've been all-stars. They've been Grey Cup champions. They've been big personalities in the league. They've embraced the league. And yet, if you pull them aside privately and ask them if they ever watched the CFL when they were growing up, they will tell you no. In fact, I know a guy who was a very good player, played in the National Football League, played in the CFL, Canadian, grew up in Toronto. He told me this: the first CFL game he ever watched, he played in.
Wow.
Think of that.
Wow.
And I mean, this is a guy who played in the NFL and grew up in Toronto. And he eventually, like everybody who gets exposed to it, became almost an evangelist for the greatness of Canadian football.
Right.
But not while he was growing up.
That's so frustrating. Moving along to, sort of where we are now as we sort of, look at the state of Canadian football at the moment. You had a great line, it's about a month ago when you said, right now it's third and long for the CFL.
Yeah.
What is it now?
It's almost like we're in a timeout with 20 seconds left on the clock. And
back-to-back delay of game penalties.
We're back-to-back delay of game penalties, backing us up to our own 30-yard line, and we're going to bring Michael Bishop in off the bench to throw a 70-yard ball. I love it when I can make a Michael Bishop reference. Yeah, I mean, that's where we are. I mean, to lay it out as simply as I can. I think the league and the Players Association have settled or solved most of their issues that they had. I don't know it's going to be to everybody's satisfaction, but I think they've negotiated pretty much as far as they can, and there's going to be, a kind of take it or leave it offer on the table for the players at this point. There's some issues that may still need to be resolved. Like the big one is guarantees. Like, are players going to leave jobs to come to the hub in Winnipeg? And then if this all blows up in a COVID explosion in 2 weeks, like, what are you sending them home with? And I think that's a legitimate question for the players to want some assurances on. The government thing has been, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious the government doesn't want to deal with this. They've had this on their front burner, or had it placed on they put it on the back burner, but the CFLs tried to put it on their front burner for months. They kicked it down the road to the Business Development Bank of Canada, which is a crown corporation that deals with high-risk loans. They gave the league a loan that the league didn't find palatable. They basically tried to put it back on the government's front doorstep and say, look, you don't owe us a yes, but you owe us an answer. Those are my words, not theirs, but that's my interpretation of the situation, right? Just tell us yes or no. But right now, we've never got a yes or no from you. We've got these kind of maybes in the Business Development Bank. So, if they can get what is a $30 million loan, then there's a chance they can go forward. And I think the curious thing to me is going to be how much will is there among both the players and the teams to go forward if they get that loan. Like, I don't think it's a slam dunk that you can book kickoff. I think there's a lot of things that have to happen in terms of logistics. And I mean, I get teams texting me all the time. How are we going to do this? What are we going to do about that? Like, there's all kinds of questions that have to be answered if they go forward playing. And I've been party to some of these conversations with teams that have real questions about how this is all going to be put together in a matter of a few short weeks. And I think there's a lot of players that aren't going to play. I think that number's probably grown as time's gone on because guys have moved on and got jobs, or they've mentally just kind of moved on. You know how sometimes when you've just kind of accepted that something's not going to happen and then says, oh yeah, it is. Well, you know what? You've moved on. I mean, I talked to a player last week, fairly prominent player, who said to me, look, my body is worth more than a third of a CFL salary and the risk of COVID. It's just not what I'm willing to put my body through for. I've talked to other players who want to play, say, hey, I'm 25, I'm single, I don't have a family, I got nothing else to do, I just want to play ball, right? So there's going to be a range there. And I think there may be some variance of will among the teams. I'm not sure all 9 teams want to play as badly equally. You know what I mean? I think there are some that really want to play. I think there are some that are very hesitant to play. So they got to sort that out. So the government getting a yes on the $30 million loan, I don't think, you just go right from there to kick off. I think there's a lot of things that have to be worked through. But I think the reason we're in this double overtime is that when you've waited 4 months for an answer from the government and you think you might get one in 48 hours or 72 hours, it's tough to tell yourself, well, let's move on. And that's kind of where we are.
Do you think any of this relates to liability at all? Like, you look at the NCAA and what's going on there, and I think liability is a big issue that they've got. Is that something that the CFL is concerned about, or is that not what they're talking about at all?
I don't think as much, because the difference between the CFL or other professional leagues and the NCAA is you have a players union that represents the group, right? So you can negotiate on the issue of liability, right? That the league can say, hey, if a player gets positive for COVID, we will be responsible for his medical care for the next 24 months, or whatever you do. You can come up with an agreement that the union then says to the players, this is how the league, we've released the league from long-term liability on COVID, but they've agreed to cover COVID-related illnesses. Like, you know what I mean? So you've got an agreement, you've got legal protection for the league. The problem in college football is there's no union. So how do you negotiate, a mitigation of liability with thousands of players, right? And it's interesting because it's an issue that's come up in college football for a long, long time, that they don't have any representation. And it's really come to a head with this COVID stuff. I think it is an issue, but I think it's an issue that's manageable or solvable if both sides have the will to do it, as opposed to what you've got in college football, where I don't know how you would begin to create liability protection, from thousands of players that aren't represented by any union.
So, final question. Do you think there is any chance right now that we see a single snap of 3-down football in 2020? If you were a betting man, how much risk are you putting out there on there being a single snap?
Well, to be clear, I've been pessimistic all along. I was on a radio show about 6 weeks ago, and the guy welcomed me and said, "Are you still optimistic there'll be a season?" I said, "Sorry, I've never been optimistic there'll be a season. Like, other than in February, I have not been. And I'm still not. I just think the number of challenges. Now, all that said, I don't believe the league would have extended itself into this week if it didn't think it had a legitimate shot of getting government money. I think they would have folded their tent last week unless they were given some indication that this is at least possible. So I've been as low as 1 or 2% that they would play. I might be in the kind of 10 to 15% range now. I don't think it's impossible. I wouldn't count on it. I just think there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of logistics that have to be climbed over, even if you do get, and really they need two things from the government, not just one. They need them to sign off on their sort of mitigation of the border rule to allow players to have sort of a quarantine that would be to some degree an exception to what other people coming across the border have, similar to what hockey has got. And you also need the government approval, and then you got to pull off all the logistics. I'll go with 10%. How's that?
It's pretty low, but that's pretty much what I'm thinking right now too. So I'm still hoping, fingers crossed, but at the same time, I don't know. I don't know what I actually, what my heart wants versus what, the decision that I think I would make. I don't think they're the same thing. So,
well, one thing I would say is that there have been a lot of people who've tied the future or the existence of the league to playing this year. Oh, if they don't play this year, the league's dead. I've never done that. In fact, that doesn't make any sense to me on any level, economic, otherwise, right? People are like, oh, the league's going to be, they don't play, out of sight, out of mind. Really? What would we say about the National Hockey League when they didn't play in 04, 05? When they came back, was that out of sight, out of mind, or was that absence made the heart grow fonder? I think it was absence made the heart grow fonder. So I've never bought into this idea that, must play at all costs. No. And in fact, I've been of the opinion that if they play or attempt to play and it goes off the rails, I think that does more damage to the league than not playing. So look, if they can play, great. If they can play safely, great. If they can play to everybody's satisfaction, sure, that's better than not playing. But I've never believed that this future of the Canadian Football League rides on having a 6-game season, in playoffs this year. That has never made sense to me, economically, logically, anything. So I'm hopeful, but I'm not sitting here going to be crushed that the league is in. Look, here's the reality: the league is going to be in real challenging times with or without playing. And the thing that's going to determine the future of the league more than anything is not whether they play this year; it's whether you can put 15 to 20,000 people in a stadium next year. That's the issue.
Great answer. And Dave, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's been awesome. You've been really generous with your time. I really appreciate you talking some football with us today.
My pleasure. Always love to do it. And it's actually fun to actually talk real football. I know we got to have the COVID conversation, but it was great to just dig into McLeod, Bethel, Thompson, Bursman. I haven't talked about those things in months. It was fun.
Dave Naylor, TSN Football Insider. That was a lot of fun. It's always great to talk to someone that loves talking about football, and Dave clearly does.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, it was fantastic. He was willing to come on with us, and he has a lot of CFL knowledge. He's one of those guys I definitely go to, for information. I really liked when he got into the idea of fans knowing when the game is. That's always been something I've felt, and it definitely kind of sparked me to try and think about some ways the Argos might improve their level of awareness in Toronto.
It seems like such a simple one too, just because not even fans per se, just like, as he said, like families, people, just generally everyone in Southern Ontario. If they know that the Argos are playing tonight, then the chances of you selling more tickets goes up that much more, because you can't sell tickets to someone that doesn't know there's a game.
Yeah, they you have to have a night.
Well, that's about going to do it for us today on this episode of the X's and Argos podcast. As always, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and tell everyone you know about us. Until next time, for JB, I'm Ben Grant saying so long, and may all your pre-snap reads be good ones. I'll see ya.
Go, Toronto Argos, go, go, go. Pull together, fight the foe.